Now that we have our basic physically based shader set up, let's go ahead and combine all of these nodes into one group so that it's really convenient to use. To do that, I'll just deselect everything with A, hit the B key for box select, and select everything except the material output. Then I'll press Ctrl G to create a new group, and you can then use the tab key to tab in and out of this group. So the first thing we need to do is add some inputs that match up with these other nodes that we've already created. So for the color, I'll just unplug the RGB from those two spots, and then I will take this diffuse color, plug that right into the group input, and then I'll take that same input and plug that back into the value down here where it was plugged in before, and then I can go ahead and delete that RGB node. So then when we press tab to go out of the node, then we have that control right here on the outside, and we don't have to worry about all of the internals. So let's press tab to go back in, and let's also create values for the roughness and metalness. So first of all, I'll just unplug the roughness from these two areas, and then I'll plug that into the second socket here. There we go. So right now it's named FAC, which is just the default name for a factor. But with the properties panel over here for the node on the right, this is the group properties. If you don't see that, you can just press N to get to all of these. So let's just click on FAC and rename it to roughness. And not only that, we can set a default value and a minimum and a maximum. So 0 and 1 for min and max is perfect, but let's set the default value to, say, 0.1. So then we can go ahead and delete this roughness node, and we can do the exact same thing for the metalness, where we can just unplug it and plug that factor right into the group input, and then also use that to plug that into the other area where the metalness is plugged in, right there to control the Fresnel. And then we can click on this over here on the right and rename this metalness. By default, we don't want it to be half metal or half not metal, usually just one or the other. And since I'm generally dealing with materials that aren't metal, I'll set the default value to 0 and leave the minimum and maximum as we find it. So now we have all of those controls really easily accessed right on the outside, but there are a couple other attributes that we should be getting as well. And that is the IOR and also the normal. Because if we have a normal map, we need to be able to plug that in really easily. So first of all, let's just take the IOR and plug that in. That's pretty much all we need to do, but over here on the right, I'm going to bring that up above the metalness and the roughness, just so that it's the first thing that we see, since it applies to both metal and non-metal shaders. Lastly, I'll tab back in, and we're going to just grab one of these normal values from the glossy node and plug that in. And then we can use that same normal value to go into the diffuse as well. And also we need to make sure that that gets plugged into the Fresnel. But since the normal value here is already taken, because we need to take that roughness into account with this node, all we need to do is make sure that whatever map gets plugged in here also affects this normal coming out of the geometry node. So I'm going to press Shift A and go down to Converter, and there's a node called Vector Math. So then I can take this vector and then just add it to the regular normal. Since the regular normal is just no bump whatsoever, then we just need to make sure that we're adding whatever map we put in. And if this doesn't have an input, then we're just going to be adding 0, and so it's totally fine the way it is. So with that, we can tab out, and we now have our complete node. This should be good for any PBR maps that you take out of Substance or anything like that. But before we finish up, I just want to show you one other handy setting that I find really helpful, and that is a clear coat option. Now this is something that they have in RenderMan, and I find it very useful, so let's just add it here really quickly as well. I'm going to take this very last mix shader and press Shift D to duplicate it, and then I'll take this glossy shader, press Shift D to duplicate that, and plug that right in. I want the roughness to be something very low, like 0.01, and then I can take the normal value and plug that in. So I'll leave the roughness very, very low, and then plug this factor value also into the group input. And so this factor value is going to determine how much of this glossy coat gets applied over our material. So I'll take this factor value and set the default value to 0, set the minimum to 0, and then the max value to 0.5. because if we want something completely shiny, then I would just make it a metal. So I'll set a max to 0.5 and I'll rename this clear coat. All right, and then I'll move it just above the normal. So this clear coat option can be very helpful in a number of circumstances. For instance, if you have something that's not metal, but maybe a little bit rough, like wood or something, and you just need a little bit of, polish on top of it, you can add a little bit of that clear coat. Also, if you have a really metal surface, but you also need a little bit of that shiny glossy coating on top of it, like car paint has, where it has metal underneath and then a gloss on top of it, then you can just increase the clear coat a little bit here, and it just makes things a little bit easier to work with. So before we wrap up, I just want to add some image textures in here as an example, just to show you a normal PBR workflow. So I've exported some textures from Substance that you can use. I've provided them in download files so you can follow along, but we can just press Shift-A, add a texture and then image texture. And I have a couple of them here. Let's just use the metal. First I'll add in the base color. And if we press Control Shift and click on this, we can preview what the texture looks like. And you can see here that there is no shading information, it's just color. So there's no highlights in here, there's no shadows or anything like that. When you're working with PBR, you don't want to add any of that information to your base color or albedo map. And we can just plug that right into the color. Then I'll press Shift-D to duplicate that image texture. And let's see which one's next. We have the bump. I'll move that down here. And when you're working with bumps or normal maps, you want to change the color space from color to non-colored data, just so we get more information out of that particular map. And then we need to plug this into the normal. But in order to do that, we need to convert it to a bump map first. So let's press Shift-A, Vector, and Bump. So we plug this right into the height, and you can see that the strength is very high, so I'll turn it down to something like 0.1, maybe 0.2. Now this material doesn't have a normal map that has any useful information, but just so I can show you how that workflow would work, I'm going to press Shift-D to duplicate this bump node, and you can see that there is also a normal map. It doesn't have any information, but we do want to set it to non-colored data. And if, for example, you wanted to use both, then you could just plug this color right into the normal, but you do need to convert it to a normal map first. So let's just go Vector and Normal Map, make sure that that's plugged right in, just like that. And then this normal can be plugged right into the shader normal. So if we take a look at this shader, we're now getting those nice bumps on the surface. So next we just need to add the roughness and metalness maps. So let's press Shift-D on this top image texture and change this from the base color to the metallic. If we take a look at that, we can see the areas where it's supposed to be metal and the areas where it's supposed to be painted over, and we can plug that right into the metalness shader. And so that's definitely starting to look better. Lastly, let's just add the roughness. So Shift-D to duplicate over here. Switch this from metallic to roughness. And as we plug this in, we have now finished with setting up our shader. And so that's all you need to do to set up a PBR workflow in Cycles. I have a couple different texture maps. I've got one for leather and wood, and you can try them out for yourself if you'd like to play around with it. But that's the gist of it. So thanks for watching this short course. I hope you learned something new, and I'm looking forward to seeing your results in the gallery.